Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Results of the 2000 census are making news. Despite the fact that poor people and immigrants are always undercounted, New York City's population outpaced the rest of the state, and there are significant implications for poor and working poor families. For today's edition of the Urban Agenda, we'll talk with civil rights advocates from our Black, Latino, and Asian communities, all of whom played key roles in Census 2000. Joining me now is John Flateau, Director of the Census Information Center at Medgar Evers College, Lucia Gomez, Civic Participation Coordinator at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Glen Magpantay, Staff Attorney with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Dave.
John, let's talk first about the undercount. When I came along a long time ago in 1980 and directed part of the census effort for the city, the question of undercount, particularly of blacks, Asians, and Latinos, was up front. Did that happen this time?
Yes, there was another undercount. The situation has improved from 80 to 90 to 2000. I think in 90, we even had a city lawsuit where the city alleged it was a 10% undercount. The Census Bureau said it was about 4% in the city. Now the statewide undercount, the Bureau acknowledges at about 2%. But when you zoom in on neighborhoods, specific neighborhoods and communities throughout the city, we still believe there is an undercount problem. For example, when you go to a place like Central Brooklyn, where there's a very large Caribbean immigrant community, the numbers say there are less people there now than there were in 1990, and that's an impossibility. Anyone who's on the ground or moving along Church Avenue or Flatbush or Nostrand or Fulton Street knows that is not the case. So yes, we still do have an undercount problem. The Bureau did a better job than they did 10 years ago, but there's still a lot of people that were not counted.
Now, Lucia, the Latino community, of course, I think stunned everyone in terms of its growth, and obviously the political implications are growing. What led to this, enormous turnaround, not only in the fact of the numbers obviously being there, but the participation rates?
Well, I think foremost, the undercount was the major mobilizing piece. One of the major mobilizing pieces was saying, let's not let it happen again. And I think the Latino community really came together, and although at the same time of coming together, there's still a major undercount, we feel, within the Latino community throughout the entire city, because the truth of the matter is you have areas like Washington Heights where they saw great levels, high levels of participation, and at the same time we're still saying there's more people than that there. There's still many more Dominicans living in Washington Heights than what you're actually noting in the entire United States. So what they know as being like 700,000 Dominicans in the entire United States are saying that's exactly what exists in New York City alone. So there are definite, when you look at it at the ground level, you're saying there's more Latinos living in Queens than what you have there.
Well, when I talk to many people, there's a question, well, why don't they come forward? What's the problem? I don't know. Glenn, as you look at the Asian community and others, why shouldn't somebody just sign up and greet their Census Bureau form with, celebration?
Part of it is that Asian Americans did do that they tried to get counted in the census, and what we found is that they couldn't get counted even when they tried. One of the situations that happened in Chinatown last year was that, I walked around Chinatown, and it was easier to get a credit card form. It was easier to apply for a credit card than to fill out a census form. You couldn't find them in Chinese, and if you could find them, they were only in English. There was another incident in Richmond Hills with the Indo-Caribbean community where you had, I think it was about 24 families who they never got a form. No one ever came to their house. They called the Bureau over the phone and said, send someone to my house. I want to get counted in the census. No one ever came. That's a problem. And the Bureau itself admits that there was an undercount. Over 3 million people were missed in this census. U.S. Census Monitoring Board estimates that over 200,000 New Yorkers were missed. That's a major problem for our communities, for Asians, for Latinos, for African Americans, when we look to political representations and fund for social services.
Well, in fact, a 200,000 difference would have meant we only lost 1 congressional seat rather than 2, I think.
Right.
Well, what are the implications, actually, John, in terms of if the count doesn't go right, what happens?
Well, you touched on one of the first ramifications, which is political representation. Right now, New York is the 3rd largest state in the country. 10 years ago, it was the 2nd largest. Now, Texas and California are ahead of New York. And when the numbers settle New York winds up with 2 less members of Congress unless those numbers are corrected. And that situation isn't totally decided yet, so that's an issue that New York should still be aggressively pursuing, and I'm concerned that that has not happened. There are undercount lawsuits from certain other jurisdictions around the country, but New York is not on top of that issue. So right now the word is we will lose 2 congressional seats in New York, and there's a political upstate, downstate battle going on right now to get New York City to eat one of those 2 seats, even though our population has just topped 8 million.
Well, I was up in Albany some weeks ago, and that was squarely on the agenda. Why should New York City be losing a congressional seat when it's the source of all the growth for the state of New York? And what does it take? What's your take on this?
Well, it's interesting that we were at the Manhattan public hearing that took place by the Legislative Task Force on redistricting and reapportionment, and that would seem to be the hottest topic of getting questions. Well, how would you do it? How would you get, if in fact they're trying to see New York City as a whole getting all this representation as not taking over Westchester County or not taking parts of Long Island County into New York City, and their rationale for not giving us the proper representation according to our population is incredible. They have no straight up rationale. It's basically Republicans don't want to lose parts of their upstate, territories. They know they're going to have to lose, and if they lose 2, that's 2 major individuals that are going to get lost, and that's upstate. That is majority Republican territory. So there's definitely a Democrat-Republican thing going on there, and that's where the undercount factors in. There is a battle in D.C. that the Republicans don't want to release the undercount figures. The Democrats do want to release the undercount figures. So it's definitely a partisan issue, and that's being definitely translated here in terms of the way in which congressional seats are going to be divvied up.
Glenn, taking the Asian community, is this the eve of starting to see the numbers being reflected in the number of Asians elected to political office, or for the first time?
I mean, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens around redistricting. For us, New York City has is the municipality with the nation's largest Asian American population. It's enormous. New York State, as a state, has the nation's 2nd largest Asian American, yet we've never seen one elected to city council, state legislature, or Congress, even with a population in the state of over 1 million. That's a problem. Now, what you've seen in redistricting in some other settings is that Flushing is divided among 4 state senate districts.
Right.
That's a problem. Now, the undercount is going to say that there's less people there and that they deserve less representation. That's a problem for us, and that's a problem for all racial minorities. So what we want to make sure is that the numbers come out, and that the numbers do reflect the accurate population that lives in the community.
I think also to further promote that issue, other communities, the rest of New York, needs to take a stand that it's unconscionable that in the year 2001 there isn't a single Asian American elected official in the city of New York, and we all know that the redistricting process is the way to set up those political districts. So to ensure that Asian Americans in New York City have the opportunity for the first time, beginning in 2001, to elect one of their own to public office.
I must admit, I get often frustrated that people think they're doing you a real favor to allow representation of groups. I think anyone who wants a stable New York, and one that's what politics is all about, not some, we're giving you something. And I guess that it becomes my personal frustration as we go along. What should we be looking at now? We've got these numbers coming on. Is there going to be an immediate shift, and we started to talk about this, Glenn, into a political reality? In other words, we've seen a rapid ramp up in the numbers of poor people and working people and people of color in the city of New York. It should be reflected in statewide politics. Do you think that's going to happen?
Yes, well, the games have begun already with municipal politics, because this is an election year, 2001, and there'll be 36 of the 51 seats in our municipal legislature are vacant. So you already have a mad scramble, a huge increase in the number of candidates seeking office, and they're the new New Yorkers, which I think is a phenomenal situation. Asian American, Indo-Caribbean, African, continental Africans for the first time running for public office in New York City. So hopefully we'll begin to see some of our new Americans achieve political representation this year in our municipal elections.
Lucia, what do you think?
I'm extremely excited. I have never seen so many elected officials, so Latino elected officials in one particular district. I'm seeing like District 10 City Council and and I keep mentioning Washington Heights because the activity in that location, when you think that majority, because they're Dominican, are not citizens, I mean, you're seeing the activity flow tremendously. So for me, that's a tremendous example. But District 10, you have a slew of like 7 or 8 just Latinos just running for that one particular district office. So I'm seeing the same thing happening in Queens, happening in Brooklyn, where you got Latinos that, you know, and majority are new immigrants.
Right.
So this idea that new immigrants don't participate in the political process is non-existent for me at this time.
Glenn, do you see the electeds or would-be electeds now participating and reaching out to the Asian community in a new way? Are they taking account? Are they making, you know, the time to reach out?
Some of them do, and some of them really don't. Some of them have described the community as marauding invaders. Julie Harrison in 1996 New York Times front page described Asian Americans as colonizers and that we eat weeds. She described bok choy as dandelion. Those are the people, some of the people that represent Asian American populations. That's a problem. In this election, it's just like the African and Latino community, we've seen almost more than a dozen Asian Americans vying for political office, and they're not just all Chinese and Korean. There are, but they're Bangladeshi, they're Indo-Caribbean, they're Indian, they're Sikh Indian, there's 3 kinds of Indian. It's wonderful. But you know, from these census figures, what needs to flow from the numbers are not only increased political representation, but services and funding for social services, bilingual ballots. Our community needs help in a lot of resources.
A demand for it.
And there is, and these numbers hopefully will help that.
We'll be right back to continue our program right after this.
You don't have to like me.
Or you can.
You don't have to run with me.
You really don't have to run away from me.
And we're not all that different. I like good food.
Good music. I want a good job.
I want my kids to live in a world
Where they are safe and loved.
And respected for who they are.
You don't have to like me. But if you talk to me,
You might.
We can end prejudice if we talk to each other.
call. Tell us what you'd do.
together we can build one America.
Welcome back to the CSS Urban Agenda. I'm David R. Jones. I'm speaking with John Flateau, Director of the Census Information Center at Medgar Evers College, Lucia Gomez of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Glen Magpantay, Staff Attorney with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. Welcome back.
Welcome.
Was there any surprises? We have the census. You know, when you were looking at the first numbers, when the first downloads or whatever they were came down, were you surprised?
I was surprised that they depicted it a little bit better than what they did in 90.
Yeah, well, I think we all
I wasn't
were.
surprised that the numbers existed that way. I was just surprised that, wow, you know, okay, census came through a little bit,
Right.
you know, and I was very excited that we can now tell the community, look, what you struggled for to happen, look, these are your fruits. So I definitely give all the congratulations to the community for having done a fantastic job. I mean, Census Bureau, you did a great job. This is what you're supposed to be doing. You know, this is what you're hired to do. This is what you know you're going to have to do every 10 years. Communities doesn't know that this is something, especially new immigrants, they don't know this is something that they need to, really know to participate in. And forget about mobilizing. This is a great experience for the community members. I think it was fantastic.
John, what did you see that surprised you?
Well, I think one of the surprises was that the non-white and new American community has actually replaced. I knew there was an outflow of white New Yorkers. I was a little surprised that the counts were so high for Asian American, Latino, and slight increase in the black community that New York's population actually jumped to that 8 million number. And the diversity that we're now going to see for the first time have the numbers to explain that none of our communities are monolithic either. I think it's fascinating to see the diversity within the Asian and the Latino and the African American communities. It's actually 3 communities. It's Caribbean, it's African American, and it's continental African.
For the first time.
And we'll have those numbers now so that we all begin to really appreciate what diversity is all about and how we have to be civil and tolerant New Yorkers to a new level.
Glenn, what about you? Anything that struck you with the new numbers?
I mean, I think it confirmed a lot of things that we already knew, that Asian Americans are growing tremendously, 50% growth, at least in New York City and New York State, that there are more Indians In New York City, South Asians, Asian other category was very large. We believe are a lot of Asian Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indo-Caribbeans, that Asians now, Chinese are in Bensonhurst, Sheepshead Bay, other parts of Queens. So I think those are some of the numbers that we knew that was out there. The census has confirmed. The biggest surprise is that the numbers are off. The biggest surprise is that the numbers still do not reflect the accurate numbers of our community. You know, the other thing that I think was a surprise was a high number of, now that you can check off more than one racial category, the high numbers of Asian multiracial, but it's not Asian and white, it's Asian and some other race, who we believe a large number might be South Asians, Indo-Caribbeans, who just checked off race in a different sort of way. They checked off Asian Indian, but they also checked off maybe, and then wrote in other, and wrote in Guyanese. So we're going to need to work with that data to see where the community is.
Lucia, do you take into account what's happening across the nation in terms of Latinos and other Hispanics? What's going on? This is not only New York City. There are all sorts of flares of population increase that are built on new Americans.
Everywhere that we saw across the country saw a huge growth in Latino population. The most ironic piece about it is that they're all moving into suburban America. And you have this small little town in the middle of Pennsylvania with this high 80%. And then when you break, and when you get all the, I mean, you see, like, for instance, like a place like Philadelphia and Allentown and Lehigh Valley, I mean, you get all these little parts together across the country. And the ones that come up on top, just by doing a regular, you know, percentage, you know, search, is the fact that Latinos are in small, tiny towns. Brewster, New York, you have people, large communities growing in Staten Island, in Long Island. I mean, in upstate New York, you know, you have still people in Syracuse and Buffalo and Albany and Rochelle, you know.
Well, I'm stunned out at the end of Long Island and near Montauk and all those fancy towns up there. All the sort of working people are Mexican. And in the space of 3 years, you watched an entire, you know, sort of sea shift, you know, of who the population, who are the working people. And obviously the political ramifications of this are huge. I think we should talk about that. Well, this isn't necessarily going to be all sweetness and light. There's going to be a struggle here.
Yes.
Because we're talking about, in New York City alone, a $36 billion budget. And theoretically, because of the way the state is going demographically, obviously New York City can have an enormous impact in deciding who the statewide office holders are. I think what's going to happen here?
I think what you've touched on is suburbanization of even the non-white populations, Black, Latino, and Asian, and a lot of what were the urban policy issues are now being exported to communities around the country, the smaller communities as well. You see issues around discrimination and representation now being raised in these smaller communities where Latinos and Asians are now showing up. It also means that the immigrant and new American communities have one type of mix in terms of their public goods and public service needs, and these issues are now confronting these smaller communities that used to be homogeneous, you know, upper middle class, and did not have to deal with issues like health care and crowded local schools, et cetera, employment issues for poor and working people, because those communities did not have that representation 10 years ago. So I think there's a tremendous creative tension going on, and our legislatures, our state legislature, for example, is now going to have to pay more attention to those kinds of issues. And the big cities that have been grappling with issues like this, like in New York City, I think we're going to, in the long run, connect with some new allies around, you know, health care, public education, and other kinds of issues.
Glenn, the Asian community has always been considered the good immigrants, the ones who were always, you know, welcome, though I know that's not true from Chinese exclusion on down. What transformation? Now we're getting to critical mass. If it's not this year, it'll be next. You'll start to see an impact on the political life of New York in terms of elected. How is this community going through the changes that they're going to be a powerful factor in the city of New York?
We hope. I mean, I think one of the things that we had said during our census campaign and telling people you need to fill out the census form, you need to get counted, is that it's the first step towards broad-based civic participation. That we begin with the census, but you also need to become a citizen. you need to naturalize, you need to register to vote, and you need to vote. And if you can't vote and if you're not a citizen, that's fine. You still need to raise your voice. You still need to call stuff out if you don't think it's appropriate. That immigrants are a part of this society and are beginning to assert what their needs and demands are. And so we're hoping we could see more immigrant participation in politics, in organizing, in community-based institutions. And you know, we see areas in New York which aren't just Asian enclaves or Latino enclaves. We have many parts of Queens where the community has similar concerns and interests around language access at the hospitals, interpreters, bilingual ballots. They're voting in elections. Candidates are building multiracial coalitions to try to assert not only what are the best needs for their community, but what are the best needs for all New Yorkers. So we're hoping that when people get into City Hall, that when people go to Albany, they're not just talking about their community, they're talking about immigrants, they're talking about the working poor, they're talking about the needs that all New Yorkers really need, and our fair share.
Now, Lucia, you know, CSS has joined with the Hispanic Federation and others in attempting a massive voter registration effort again.
That's great.
You think this is going to work? Is this going to fire up these communities? Look, they have the numbers. It's been reported. They are clearly on the eve of some major watershed transformation in the politics of New York City and state. Do people get it? Are people excited about it?
I think people are definitely excited about it. I mean, I think, look what happened in Los Angeles with the mayoral race, right? I mean, but you're getting the idea that it's just not enough only for, like, for instance, for there to be a Latino candidate and all Latinos to rally against, you know, for that candidate. The most ironic part about it is that if you're a Latino candidate, you only serve Latinos. You know, if you're a black candidate, you only serve the black community. If you're an Asian candidate, you're only there for the Asian community. That's not the case. Why is it that when you have a non-minority candidate, that person is all-encompassing, beautiful rainbow coalition, and yet you can't get our own candidates to be able to get that type of image? Well,
I've been struck by the press coverage of clearly one of the chief candidates here, almost discounting it from the beginning. It's extraordinary. I've never seen press coverage that seems so biased in terms of how little attention they're paying to essentially ethnic and people of color. It's been fascinating watching this whole candidacy play out and marginalizing what clearly, now we have the numbers and the vote, and yet you'd never know it if you read some of the mainstream press in New York City.
Yeah, but I mean, there's something else that we need to take into consideration, which is that there are still problems in the vote.
Right.
That there are people who went to go vote in the last election and
Absolutely.
they couldn't, even when they tried. That the ballots are translated to Chinese under the Voting Rights Act, and they flip the party headings for Democrats and Republicans. So the Democrats ran as Republican, the Republicans ran as Democrats. I didn't know that Senator Padovan was a Democrat.
I think he'd be very upset to hear.
But that's what happened in Queens. We had instances in which poll workers said that you don't have to give an affidavit ballot to the Asian voters. They don't need to be here. Or that a South Asian voter in Floral Park was asked, do you have your naturalization papers with you? That's a problem. This isn't Selma, Alabama. No. This is Queens, New York. And Asian Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities still have problems in executing their right to vote. So we will do voter registration. We will encourage more people to get involved. But ultimately, we're hoping that there will be some change at the Board of Elections to make sure that our communities can exercise their right to vote.
And some more get out the vote. Some more get out the vote type initiatives. I mean, you get them registered to vote, but do they come out to vote? Do they understand what it means to fill out that paper that gives their name, their address, and where do they go vote afterwards? Who's doing that type of mobilizing? I think there needs to go.
Well, new citizens do vote. I mean, in large numbers.
Let me just hear from John. And what do you think? Are people getting excited in the community?
Well, I think some are getting it. I think that smart politicians understand it. If they're going to stay in power and stay ahead of the curve, they have to embrace this revolutionary demographic change that's going on in New York. And you still have, as Glenn pointed out, I guess, some of the thickheads that still don't get it. But I think the change is inevitable in this town, that the face of New York is changing, and that 5 years from now, you'll see Asian American elected officials. They'll be a commonplace issue here in New York, and New York will move on.
It's going to be exciting. My thanks to our guests today on the Urban Agenda. Results of the 2000 census are attracting increased attention to our city's minority communities in ways that are unprecedented. At CSS, the official numbers confirm what we already knew, that New York City's population is growing and immigrants are revitalizing our neighborhoods. The corresponding realization is that political power is just around the corner for the very groups that have been marginalized in the past. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for joining us for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.